On behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service and UW-Marathon County, we welcome you to the University of Wisconsin Center for Civic Engagement for tonight's special forum featuring retired Congressman David Obey and current serving Congressman Tom Petri. My name is Eric Jordano, and I am an Associate Professor of Political Science here on campus and the Interim Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. For nearly 40 years, through the Better Way Club, Congressman Obey brought national leaders to the 7th Congressional District for an evening of conversation on vital issues of the day. Proceeds from the event helped fund the Congressman's many successful election campaigns. With the campaigns at an end, many people mentioned that they would like to see such forums continue, but with a different purpose, to help establish and fund the Wisconsin Institute's Student Civic Leadership Program. And so, with gracious agreement, Congressman, I elevated you for a minute, or did I did I put you down a notch? Sorry. So, Congressman Obey instituted the new Better Way Club, established this year to support education, for which we are extremely grateful. This is our second such fundraiser. The first was held this spring, and we had the wonderful visit from Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. I really wanted you to know that the proceeds from that event did indeed go toward the launching of our inaugural Student Civic Leadership Program, which began this fall at UW-Marathon County. Tonight's forum would also not be possible without the hard work of WIP staff, and with particular thanks to Connie Nicolai, who you saw greeting out front. We're also grateful for the support of Ian Reese, our intern coordinator, for Chris Berg, our theater technician, Chris McCaslin, our campus events and scheduling coordinator, Brian Becker, our university relations director, Jane Stencil, our food services director, and of course our WIP's interns. And a special thanks to Jan Kelton, who is Congressman Obey's assistant, to Claire Wetstein and Tyler Vorpagel from Mr. Petri's office. We're so grateful for your help and support tonight. At this time, we'd also like to recognize a few dignitaries that are in our audience, and if I miss anyone, just know that you're even higher than they are. In your heart, just know that. So, for example, I did see here today Dave Anderson, who is Sean Duffy's district chief. Dave, we'll welcome you. Thanks for being here. Appreciate that. Former district director for Tom Petri, I should add. And also Pat Kreitlow, who is a candidate for the seat here in the 7th District. And then we also have Colleen Thomas, who is on the staff for Senator Cole's office. So we'd like to thank all of you for being here and also for recognizing really the importance of this conversation and the idea that we're having a conversation across the aisle. And we're so thankful for your support in being here. Finally, there's one group of people I'd like to introduce, and those are the student leaders who are benefiting from the program we had in the spring and also from this program. We're very excited for the work that they are doing this year in learning and becoming leaders in their own right. And I wanted to mention there was an editorial recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education by Wayne Firestone, the president of Hillel Foundation, who basically starts it out by saying, civility has had a bad run of luck lately. And interestingly, his response is embedded in the title of his editorial, which is as follows: yearning for civil discourse, ? Listen to your students. And he goes on to say that we actually have a generation of young people who really want to have civil discourse, who want to work together to solve our problems. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the next generation of our civil leaders, the students of our student leadership program. If you would please stand and be recognized. Thank you very much. The state of politics in America is the subject of tonight's conversation. Our presentation will begin with introductory remarks by Congressman David Obey, followed by a short response from Congressman Tom Petri. Following their remarks, our distinguished guests have requested that rather than give long speeches tonight, they would much rather interact directly with you, the audience. So we will open up the floor for question and answer. We will have our WHIPS interns circulating with microphones, and we encourage you to join us for this conversation. However, because of the generosity of our guests in doing so, we would certainly appreciate it if we could limit your questions to questions, not to political statements or grandstanding. And I will be moderating the session and to make sure that we are following those guidelines. And also, please remember that we are here to have a civil discourse. And while we certainly encourage discussion and maybe even disagreement, we encourage you also to do so with respect for one another and one another's opinions. We ask at this time that you check to see that all of your electronic devices are silenced, and we'll proceed by introducing Congressman Obey. David Obey grew up in Wausau, Wisconsin, graduating from Wausau East High School. He attended the University of Wisconsin-Marathon County, and, as I said last spring, after learning everything he could possibly need to know here, he then went to UW-Madison, earned a degree, and ultimately earned a master's degree in Soviet politics and Soviet studies. He is married to the lovely Joan Lipinski, and I did note that some of her family are here tonight. We're grateful for them being here. And he has two sons. Congressman Obey was elected to the Wisconsin State Assembly in 1963 and served until his election to the U.S. House of Representatives from Wisconsin's 7th District in 1969. Serving until 2011, he remains the longest-serving congressman in Wisconsin history. Among many accomplishments, he chaired the commission that wrote the House's Code of Ethics, served on the House Budget Committee, chaired the Joint Economic Committee, and was a long-serving member and then chairman more than once of the House Appropriations Committee. His political priorities included strengthening federal investment in education, expanding access to affordable health care, affordable tax cuts fairly distributed to taxpayers, agricultural policy that helps family farmers, environmental protection, and bipartisan support for efforts to secure the homeland, especially measures that today are protecting our borders, ports, transportation system, and food supply. He is the author of a book whose title is kind of fun and actually very honest to who he is, Raising Hell for Justice, The Battles of a Heartland Progressive, published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2007. Finally, as I mentioned last year, one of maybe the little-known accomplishments, but something we certainly like to highlight, is that Congressman Obey was named as a Wisconsin Institute Senior Fellow this year, and we're very grateful to have him on board. So welcome and thank you, Congressman Obey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me thank everyone for being here tonight. Especially let me thank our guest for being here. And let me simply say that I'm extremely happy to be sharing the platform with Tom Petri. Tonight you will hear each of us give you our perspective on the subject of what has happened to politics in this country and why. What will happen is that I will first tell you something about our guest. I will then make some comments about what I think the major causes are for the disintegration of political discourse in this country. And then Tom will respond and do the same, and then we'll enter into a conversation with you. First, let me talk about Tom Petri. If you take a look at the Almanac of American Politics and see what it says about him, it says, as a moderate Republican, Petri is in a minority of his party. He legislates as if he's from a different era, and he is. First elected in 1979, Petri remembers a time when the House was more collegial and less partisan. If he's from another era, then I am from the pre-glacial era, but because I've got 10 years on him. But let me simply say that Tom is one of the most innovative legislators that I've had the opportunity to serve with. He was born in Wisconsin. I did not know until recently that he had spent much of his early childhood living in Puerto Rico. He also earned a law degree from Harvard. He then clerked for Judge James Doyle, the father of our recent governor. He was elected to the state senate. He ran for the United States Senate against Gaylord Nelson. As you know, Gaylord and I were very close, and Gaylord told me that Tom Petri was the most able and the most decent opponent he had ever encountered. That gives you some idea, I think, of the measure of the man. He went to Congress in 1979, succeeding a good friend of mine, Bill Steiger. Bill and I went to college together and did a lot of things together in the Congress before he died. And Tom has ably served that district since that time. He has been the senior Democrat on both the Transportation Committee. I mean, a Republican. Pardon me, Tom. Pardon me, Tom. Don't take offense. But he's been the senior Republican on the Education and Labor Committee and on the Transportation Committee. He did a lot of work in helping to see to it that Wisconsin moved from the era when we received 70 cents back from the federal government for every dollar we sent to the federal government for transportation. He was instrumental in helping to move us to the point where we were now getting back as much as we sent. It took a lot of skill to get that done. He also has taken the leadership on the Education and Labor Committee in the areas of student loans and in the area, for instance, of the Earned Income Tax Credit, which he showed a lot of imagination in working through the Congress. I think it's fair to say that Tom is one of the most civil members of the House, and he has served Wisconsin incredibly well in the years that he's occupied that seat. You'll hear more from him in just a moment. But let me, after I again thank Tom for his presence here tonight, let me make some comments on the subject at hand for the evening and then toss it over to Tom to get his perspective on things. A lot of things have changed since I first entered politics, since I first ran for the legislature in 1962. That was before Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon. It was before Woodstock. It was before Jack Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. It was before the Vietnam War. So we've seen a lot of changes in that time. And we've also seen a lot of changes in politics. Just to toss out some examples. When I ran for the legislature, I spent $1,160. $1,160. Today, they spend astronomical sums to get elected. When I was elected to Congress, you didn't have nationalized campaigns for Congress. Pretty much every individual member or challenger, they were on their own. And the national parties had very little to say about what happened in those local races. We didn't have permanent campaigns in those days. For the first year out of a 2-year term, you were actually able to deal with substance without having the politics of every issue just totally overwhelm everything that you do. We didn't have single issue groups with the power that they have today. And one of the reasons for that is that the Congress votes on a whole lot of things on roll call votes today that it didn't vote on when I went to Congress. When I went to Congress, you could not get an amendment. I mean, you could not get a roll call vote on an amendment to a bill that was being debated in the House unless that amendment was adopted by a division vote, not a roll call vote. And then the manager of the bill had the opportunity to try to defeat that amendment when the House reconsidered it, and he had an opportunity to get a roll call vote. What that has done is to enable every interest group in the country to play gotcha with every politician in the House by having hundreds and hundreds of amendments on very narrow gauge issues, and the parties themselves now routinely engage in these amendments that are offered often only for the purpose of embarrassing one side or the other in the Hill, and it's made it much more difficult to actually legislate and get something done. News coverage. There are 300 newspapers that used to provide direct reporter coverage on Capitol Hill today. Or they used to 5 years ago, who do not do so today because of what's happening to the profitability in the news business. And as I said the last time we were here in our last forum, people absorb information in different ways than they did when I first went to Congress. When I went to Congress, you had 3 networks. Everybody in the country who wanted to sat down for the evening news, and they all caught about the same news. So it was a unifying experience. Today, you've got the 24-hour news cycle. You've got hundreds of outlets, and people are self-reinforcing in the programs that they watch. Liberals watch MSNBC, conservatives watch Fox, and if you don't know what you think, you watch CNN. And it becomes and people tune in to the channels that are most likely to spit back things that agree with their own biases. So everybody's biases are reinforced, and in that sense, the country becomes more and more polarized. We then have this, when I went to Congress, there was no such thing as members pledging or signing pledges to do A, B, or C, or not do A, B, or C. Today, you've got people like Grover Norquist who insist that members sign a pledge never to raise taxes in any way, shape, or form. In the past, I've had a couple of unions try to do the same thing with me. They didn't get very far, but that was another era. We had, to illustrate how different things have become, 1982, Bob Michel was the Republican floor leader. And after the Reagan budget lost its popularity, Michel was in a lot of trouble in Peoria, in his district. And it looked like Bob might lose the election. Who do you think went out of his way to raise money to help Bob Michel be reelected? It was Tip O'Neill. Tip went out and raised money because he thought that Michel was a constructive minority leader, and for the good of the House, he thought that Bob should be reelected. Can you imagine that happening today without whoever did it being skinned alive? I certainly can't. And I think there is another very basic reason. When I went to Congress, people just expected that the Democratic Party was going to control the House. And for 40 straight years, they did. So when one party controls the House for 40 years, people get sort of settled into their ways, and they get comfortable dealing with each other. And if you're a majority who wants to stay in a majority, the best way to guarantee that is to have a contented minority. And so the Democratic majority learned how to work with Republican minority members in order to get their votes on a fairly regular basis, and the Republicans learned how to work with Democrats in doing the same thing. But then when the elections began to get more competitive, that meant that the stakes were much, much higher. And the higher the stakes, human nature lays out what's going to happen. The higher the stakes, the more combative the arena is going to be. And I think that is a major reason why politics is more brutal today, because there is a chance in virtually every election that the parties are going to flip in terms of control. And I think there's another historical reason, and then I'll stop and turn it over to Tom. I think about every 70 or 80 years, all hell breaks loose in this country. In the 1770s, we had a decade-long debate before we finally made the decision to break from Mother England, and so we fought a war about it. And that decided what the nature of government was going to be and what the nature of society was going to be for the next many years. Fast forward 60 or 70, 80 years, the 10 years before the Civil War. We had a huge fight about the major social issue of our time, slavery, or of their time, I mean, slavery. And then we also had a huge fight about the power of the central government. And Abe Lincoln in the Civil War settled how that was going to work out. Then FDR was elected when the economy went to hell in the 1930s, and he led a national debate about whether or not we should begin constructing a large, hefty safety net under people to help families, to give them some insurance against economic insecurity. And we had a very controversial few years until things sort of settled in. Harry Truman had to refight that fight in '48 when the political right wing wanted Eisenhower to sort of repeal the New Deal. When Eisenhower came into power, he said, no way. And so society had reached a multi-decade understanding of what the status quo was going to be. But now there is terrific pressure to scale back that safety net, and you are having a huge debate, not just about individual issues, but about the role and the power of government in shaping this society. And that becomes, those are issues that are very deeply held. They're philosophical, and it gets really nasty when they're not just philosophical, but when they become ideological. And so I think all of those account for what has happened to politics today. And I wish we had the power to change them, but as Tom knows, each individual member of Congress is 1/435th of 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. Plus, you've got 50 state legislatures and governors floating around and thousands of municipalities. And so when somebody else says he serves on the powerful this committee or that committee, I think, boy, don't I wish. But that's basically my read on what's happened to politics. And now I invite my good friend Tom to give us his read.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me up here to Wausau. You spent a couple minutes saying something about me, so I think I ought to reciprocate. We met Dave really when I was elected to the House of Representatives, but I'd heard a lot about him before that from our mutual friend and my predecessor, Bill Steiger, who came only, I think he was elected in '66. Yeah. You were elected in '69, so he was there just bore you were. But actually, they worked together, knew each other in college, worked together in the state legislature, and then, and you do get a sense of, after a while, the one thing people in politics tend to be able to do after a while is to tell the difference between true conviction and BS, basically, because you hear a lot of it in the halls of Congress and in the political process. And he always spoke very highly of Dave. And in fact, the two of them, when they were the younger, I think Steiger was the youngest member of the Republican Wisconsin delegation, and Dave was the junior member of the Democratic delegation, and Wisconsin lost a seat in 1970. And the senior members in both parties said, well, these younger guys, maybe I'll get it a little wrong, but basically are more attuned to how things are going and have worked together, let them handle it. And they did redistricting, and Bill always spoke very highly of Dave because the demographics at that time indicated that the seat that had to be lost was probably a consolidation in the northern part of the state. And
it was my seat that was
and
lost.
it was his seat. So he had something at stake. And so that happened, but it ended up working out all right as it turned out. And one or two other comments on what you've said. You were elected when in the House of Representatives when they still had roll call voting. And this doesn't make a whole lot of difference maybe in the greater scheme of things.
Explain what you mean by roll call.
It used to be, as if you watch on TV, the Senate, they call the roll of the Senate. They'll do it twice, and the senator, and then they'll hold it open sometimes. So they kind of, their schedules are pretty easy to manage because they generally sort of know agreement between the party leaders that they'll vote on, say, Wednesday afternoon, and the rest of the week is pretty well free for them to go to hearings or to meet other commitments as they wish. The House, throughout history until the late, I think it was sometime in the 1970s, did the same thing. 435 people. So you're going to call 435 names twice, and that means basically a roll call could take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, probably, or at least 2 or 3, because they would go through it once, they'd go through it again, people would start coming in, milling around, people got to know each other just standing around waiting until their names were called, and all of that sort of thing. The House, because of that, really couldn't mechanically have very many votes. Roll call votes. So they developed all kinds of other traditions and procedures, standing votes, counting. There was an old British thing that came back when Charles II was trying to kill members of Parliament, which was a sort of a teller vote, where you didn't, it was secret in a sense. The party leaders would stand or appoint people to stand, and people would go down the aisle and who were for it and then who were against it, and they would count the noses, but they wouldn't know the exact identity necessarily automatically of the members. You couldn't. So they did all those kind of things, and it was very hard to get a roll call vote unless there was agreement between the parties and it was on a major issue, and then it did occur. Now we get, it's not unusual to have 30 votes a day. It was sold as an efficiency measure. We'll think of all the time we'll say if we don't have 3 hours to have a vote. We still have 3 hours, but we have 30 votes. And it's very, and they're on every procedural thing under the sun. And as David has said, many of them are basically kind of gotcha votes. And you have to reconcile yourself, given the way the political business has evolved or process has evolved, to understand if you're a candidate for office who's held office for a little while, that with these new type of campaigns, there will be 3 or 4 issues if it's a contested campaign that will be mounted against you. But basically, regardless of how you actually voted and what you believe, it's kind of what works in polls. They can find something or another to sort of argue that vote represented that issue, and it may or may not. It's really very weird. It has very little to do with the real in-depth substance of the job of being a representative. But Dave mentioned a couple. And when I was in the state Senate, I'm a little sensitive on that. Bob Knowles, the younger brother of Warren Knowles, who's a great a respected leader in our state in an earlier period, was the leader of the state Senate. And he tried to get the 6 freshmen at the time, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans who were elected together for dinner every so often, kept trying to sell us on voting to go to electronic voting in the state Senate. And I kept thinking about it and thinking about it, and I think with 33 people, you weren't going to save that much time. And we didn't do it, finally. And I personally wish they'd never done it in the Congress of the United States, because it's a false, it looks like it's going to be efficient, but it's a false efficiency, because it assumes if you have more votes and you do it faster, you increase our output. And that's not the true nature of the legislative, representative, and deliberative process. We're attempting to adjust public policy to changes in circumstances and to hope to use government as an instrument for the welfare of the community and not just produce more votes. And so anyway, the period, I came in sort of at the tail end of the period that David is describing. And I can still remember, and Dale Kildee, who's retiring this year as a member of the Education Labor Committee, kids me about it every so often. The chairman of the committee at that time was a guy named Carl Perkins, who was an old New Deal fellow from Hingham, Kentucky. And it was a very crusty, colorful guy. Carl liked to have field hearings, and the deal was, if you wanted a field hearing in your district, you had to go to his district. And he would circulate around the committee, Republicans and Democrats, and see how many people were willing to do it. And if you agreed to go on this thing, there'd be 8 or 10 people on the committee. You'd go to Carl's district, and then you'd go to each of the other people's districts. So I signed up as a junior member to show how influential I was in Washington, and Carl Perkins came out to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and then went over to Cleveland to have hearings of the Education Labor Committee on education issues. The thing was, though, that the other members stayed at a hotel. Carl was about the same age as my father, and so I asked if it'd be all right if he could stay at my parents' house at a guest bedroom, and he did. And I went off to bed, and Carl and my dad sat up having a few drinks and talking about the Great Depression and World War II and so on. And I think my dad was a pretty good salesman, because the next morning we had this breakfast, and Carl Perkins stood up and said, "You have sent that young man who's to Washington, and I think you should elect him and re-elect him." And Dale said, they kept leaning over saying, "Carl, he's in the wrong party." And then he did it again at lunch. So but those were different times. The other thing is that we aren't supposed to necessarily. It's harder for people to get to know each other as well nowadays for a variety of reasons. You communicate instantly and globally, but you don't get to know people necessarily by doing that. You get to know them by spending what we call in the family context quality time, or just sort of hanging out or enduring situations together, and you build bridges that way. And in Congress, in the days of before airplane travel and modern communications, that was much more likely, because people would be elected. It would be a big thing to go from Wisconsin or points west out to Washington. People would basically make that move and with their families and spend a lot of time sharing that experience regardless of partisanship. And the other thing is, we were at the end of the Depression and World War II may have pulled people apart at the beginning, but by the end, and certainly World War II, it pulled the country together for a generation, much more completely than probably any generation, certainly since the Civil War, and then it was two North and South that were maybe pulled together. And you saw this whole generation of people in both parties, whether it was Kennedy and Nixon or Jerry Ford and so on, Lyndon Johnson, even Hubert Humphrey, the people who had a shared experience and were determined to do their best to build the country and to avoid the mistakes that had been made in the past. And the Depression, the last thing, and that two things, my father always was quite conservative, but he was always very happy, not happy, but proud to be able to pay taxes because it meant he was earning money at a job. And if you lived through the Depression, you had a different mindset about that. And the final thing is my mother was from a big family, and one of the sayings always was, if two people always agree, one of them's unnecessary. And so one thing that Dave's always had is he clearly has strong opinions, and we may not always agree on things, but if you listen, you sometimes can learn a little something. And so that process is very important, and it's been harder to realize in the current politics. One thing he's mentioned that I think is really true, and that is there a big realignment in American politics that occurred in the 1960s. It used to be before then, you had a formal, certainly after World War II, and it kind of emerged during the later stages of the 30s. You had a long-standing, quote-unquote, Democratic majority, but it was not necessarily an ideological majority because you had the Southern contingent who really tended to be pretty supportive of each other because of the experience of the Civil War and occupation and Reconstruction, and those scars were still healing, and many of them were very conservative. The House of Representatives was run essentially by the Rules Committee. When I was growing up, there was a fellow named Howard K. Smith, who was chairman of the Rules Committee, and was also the Committee on Committees. They set the rules, they made committee assignments, and I think they had much broader powers than they ever did now. And so there was a kind of a conservative Democratic and Republican functioning majority on a lot of issues that enable people to work across party lines, and they would be allies on some issues and disagree on other issues. That tended to break down with the realignment that occurred in the 60s and 70s, and we're still experiencing that. So you put that realignment together with a communications revolution that we're still trying to adjust, that is causing reorganization of all kinds of institutions in society, eliminations of a lot of levels of management and organization, and how you can adjust to build in some time for consideration and deliberation when you can just do things like that, but it may not be wise to do them just like that. Big issue. And so I think we, in the House of Representatives, one other point I was going to make is that we talk about the political figures and the change in the politics. One thing that impressed me a lot, and still does from the time I got to Congress, is that there is a very, very strong, dedicated professional staff. Not only necessarily, some of them are nonpartisan, officially nonpartisan. Others may be partisan, but they're really not. That's work for the House of Representatives and for many of the committees. The one office we never talk about publicly that much is the parliamentarian's office. And you get to know those people, and they come out of college usually, or graduate school, and dedicate their whole life to working for the institution of in our case, the House of Representatives, or over in the Senate. And if you see someone presiding over the House, it looks like they're presiding over the House, but you quickly learn they're really doing what the parliamentarian tells them to do. And the parliamentarian works for the House, and his job is to help the majority, whether it's Republican or Democratic, work its will within the rules. And if they don't they can't work their will, they maybe have the ability to change the rules, but they shouldn't just do what they want to do ignoring the rules, because if you're a body that's making laws, you should have some sense of respect for the rules, or else why should any people pay attention to the rules that you're making? So that's ingrained after a while pretty seriously. And I think to Newt Gingrich's credit, at the time that we had this transition, there was an outcry in my caucus after 40 years, as you can imagine, to throw everyone out, including the House chaplain and all these people. And at the end of the day, that didn't happen. And cooler heads were prevailed upon, and they sat down and thought about and realized that there was a big purpose to be served in institutional continuity and integrity. And one thing that people in the House of Representatives have always admired about Dave is he was regarded as a man of the House. He was a very strong partisan fighter, but he was also a strong proponent of the institution of the House of Representatives, because it is there for a purpose. And where it's weakened or undermined, you pay a price that you may not see in the short term. You get some quick advantage, but you basically lose and undermine over time. So anyway, that my own feeling is, as you pointed out earlier, there have been ebbs and flows in this. The Civil War broke out in the Congress. I'm learning more about the details of that, but as I understand it now, some senator in some debate made what sounded like a fairly mild comment, but if you knew the lingo and the custom of the time, it was very insulting to a Southern, one of his Southern colleagues, and I think his nephew or something who was over in the House of Representatives went over and clubbed the guy on the floor of the Senate. And one was from North Carolina, and the other person was from, I think from Massachusetts. And this was in by 1850, late 1850s. And in the next election, they were both overwhelmingly reelected by their constituents. So instead of recoiling because these people took the law into their own hands and actually engaged in attempted murder on the floor, or at least maiming on the floor of the Congress, they were honored and acclaimed and were heroes, each in their own region of the country. It was at that point, I think, that the people who were elected representatives from around the country realized that compromise had become a dirty word. How can you compromise principle when something like slavery is involved, and so on and so forth? And the result was that the Civil War broke out and more Americans were killed than ever before or since. So what we're engaged in may sound frivolous and just sort of politics in the short run, but in the long run, it's very important to do what we each can to promote the idea of, sure, you're going to disagree, but you can benefit from that if it's constructive and if you're actually listening, and if at the end of the day you can work out something that can accommodate those differences and let you move forward in a constructive way. That's one of the reasons I've always enjoyed being in this business, because if it was easy, we wouldn't have to worry about it. It's very hard, as anyone with a family or any other political entity knows. But it's worth it, and I think we will, I believe, adjust and get through this. And I do sense myself, maybe it's being from Wisconsin, people are always saying, oh, well, what do you guys smoke up there in Wisconsin when we say something that's, and our politics lately has not been necessarily all that civil in every respect. But people from Wisconsin, I sense, by and large, try to be positive, and we do figure out how to work things out in the end, and I think we will.
Thank you, Tom. I want to add just one, go ahead. I want to expand on just one point that Tom made, and that's the generational differences that he talked about. I absolutely agree that what's now called the greatest generation, the World War II generation, they were much more successful in working with each other because they'd been through the ringer together on the economy, they'd been through the ringer on the war, and after they'd done that, they knew what was important and what was marginal. And so they took a much more cooperative approach and were much more willing to have society pursue cooperative alternatives rather than individualistic, selfish alternatives.
Can I interrupt one quick thing on that?
Yeah.
I meant to mention when I was talking about Bill Steiger and you that Mel Laird took me aside after I got to Washington. And everyone knew who Mel Laird was. He was Secretary of Defense, and he was the bomb head guy, you know, if you grew up in the Vietnam generation. But of course, he was David's predecessor. And he always spoke very highly of you and your family. And he said whenever he was in Warsaw, he made it a point to stop by and have a pop or two at the family establishment, which was the watering hole for a lot of the Democrats in Warsaw. And he felt it was important for, and I think it was, to basically do as much as he could to work and be familiar with everyone. And you were in the assembly after a while, so there were issues he was working with you. And after you succeeded him, well, he probably disagreed and may have done political things one way or another. He also, I know the two of you worked very closely for many years on things that he was interested in and you were interested from this district, like the Marshfield Clinic, and helping to turn that into a premier regional and national and leader institution. So you can get something done if you work with someone, even if you don't, on something you agree on, even when you disagree on other things. So.
Well, the reason that I am hopeful about getting through this is because if you take a look at the newest public opinion polls, you will see that it's usually the baby boomer generation that is the most polarized. But you see with the younger generation, the under 30 group in society, you see them respond to these polling questions in a way that indicates that they are much more interested in a communitarian approach to issues, in a cooperative approach to issues, than the generation just ahead of them. And so I think as that younger generation begins to vote more and more and more, as the younger generations always do as they get older, I think that they're going to bring to bear a stronger demand for solutions to problems that involve recognizing the other fellow's problems as well as your own, and that is bound to spill over in politics if we can just get there. So at this point, it's open for comments or questions.
Okay, so do we have our microphones ready? Okay, so at this time we'd like to take some questions from the audience. You can just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone by. Maybe I'll start out with a question, and maybe you kind of answered it there, Congressman Obey, and I know Congressman Petri, you mentioned something too about this. When you talked about the 70-year cycle, I couldn't help but notice that they were all either preceded by or followed by war, and you mentioned that, you know, the thing that brought us together after the Depression was, you know, World War II. Well, here we have an era where America has been involved in wars, and yet it's probably been the wars that have least impacted American society generally. Not to say that they haven't at all, but just in terms of the personal connection. So I'm wondering, are you therefore optimistic that we can come together as a society, or do you think that this fundamental clash of values, which David Brooks wrote about in an op-ed about exactly a year ago in the New York Times, when he said, you know, there's this fundamental clash of values between communitarian sort of ideas about society and sort of this rugged individualism. Can we really make some adjustments to overcome this, or is this something much larger that's going to take a much larger sort of solution?
Well, let me just respond to your point about the wars. Yeah, we've had 2 wars recently, but it's very different when you have an all-volunteer army, because then everybody isn't in it. It's only military families who get hammered by that war. And the vast majority of Americans wind up escaping the problems and the camaraderie that comes from that shared experience that people had in World War II. So I think that's a little different. All I can say is the other thing that you need for the politics to calm down is the economy needs to get better. Every time that the economy is in bad shape, people are going to be surly, they're going to be nervous, they're going to be uptight, they're going to be angry, they're going to be scared. And the more worried you are about holding your own family together, the less time and energy that you have to worry about somebody else's problems. And so I think always the thing that you can do to most help bring people together again in some common purpose is to get the economy moving. Tom?
Yeah, I think this is really World War II brought us together, and to some extent World War I. It's hard to believe World War I was only a little over a year long for the United States. We got in, and basically the German side realized that they were going to get overwhelmed and had to sign an armistice. But we really, after World War II, the Korean War, certainly in the Vietnam War, well, we had the draft did not really rise anywhere near to that, and there were a lot of people who weren't really necessary. It was divisive in some senses because of that. There's a lot of talk and interest in trying to figure out some way. Sometimes people say, well, let's go back to the draft. The mechanics of that and what these people would really do, it's hard, it could be counterproductive if it's not something constructive that they can do. The idea of volunteers, I happen to serve in the Peace Corps. I know a lot of people, different churches, other organizations try to figure out ways where kids can, or young people can do volunteer service of some kind or another. There's a lot of talk about trying. We do have, American AmeriCorps and other programs. How to do that in a way that involves people constructively. It's not something that ends up turning into a boondoggle because people feel it's sort of there's no real purpose to what they're doing, or they're just sort of not well organized is a problem. But to the extent we can emphasize and encourage people to really experience something beyond their own self and their own community where they're learning and trying to do something constructive, I think that should be encouraged.
Okay, thank you. And I think hopefully we have some questions. I see a hand down here.
Hi, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the role that corporatism has in the current environment. It seems to me that corporations have found that they can buy elections, that they can write legislation, that they can funnel money to people that agree with their interests, and then they control the media to tell us all what to think about all that. So I'd just like to hear your views as people from Congress, what you think about that.
Well, let me comment first and then ask Tom to. As some of you know, when I'm in Washington, I do some work with Dick Gephardt. And one of the things that Dick has specialized in is trying to bring labor and management together in order to get through. Example, he works very closely with Ford Motor Company and with the Ford Union, trying to get them to work with each other and recognize that if they don't have a common approach to problems, they're going to be out of business and there aren't going to be any jobs. I really believe that what we really need in this country is to have, and I think this is primarily focused on business schools and college. I think that business schools need to have on the plate, to a much greater extent than they do now, discussions of the necessity for anybody who's going to be a business executive to learn the human relations skills and to learn how to take into account the needs of people in the workforce. Dick gives this example. One West Virginia company that he worked with, they were a die casting operation, and they produced about 11 ton of whatever it was they produced a day, and they felt they needed to get to 15 ton in order to be profitable. So Dick brought in his team. They sat down with the workers. They took 149 recommendations from the workforce. They implemented 12 of them. And today they're pumping out 20 ton a day because people had the sense that management listened and that the barrier between management and labor was soft, and that you could work out your problems. And I think that lesson needs to be applied nationwide, very, very broadly. You know, the job of a corporation is to make money for its stockholders. I understand that. But it's also, if the economy is going to function well, you need to have, you cannot afford to have a surly workforce that feels that it's slowly being squeezed out. And when you look at what has happened in the economy over the years, I mean, under Jack Kennedy, the average worker on the plant floor, I said that wrong, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation made about 12 times as much as the guy on the shop floor. Today it's almost 400 times. You can't sell to the average citizen of this country. You can't sell the idea that somehow you're getting a fair shake with that. And that's why I think you see this marching on Wall Street, and that marching on Wall Street is, there will be a lot of people who are there who don't know really why they're there and don't know what their focus is, but there are a lot of people who also do, and this is at the guts of it. And I think it's one of the greatest problems we have in the country, and it's not going to be solved until business, labor, and government recognize that we've just got to rebuild a different relationship, or we're not going to be very competitive.
Yeah, I think you need to break the problem down a little bit. One area that I think has bothered a lot of people, certainly has bothered me, and Congress has tried to deal with it, not all that effectually in a lot of cases, is how you need to have good, fair, sensible regulation of economic activity. No one disputes that. Just like you do of your roads. I mean, I argue with Ron Paul, very libertarian, and he was saying, he was even at one point against the Defense Department. Well, the people will figure out how to defend themselves. And what about roads? Well, they'll figure out how to build roads. I said, well, don't you need the government at least to tell people whether they should drive on the left side or the right side of the road? Doesn't that make using the roads more efficient? If, you know, oh no, they'll fight it out. The big, you know, anyhow. but that hasn't worked in some cases recently in financial regulation, for example, as well as it should have. There you have what they call the golden triangle. People move in and out of regulatory agencies, corporations, and government jobs back and forth. And we've tried to deal with the reality and with the appearance with all kinds of rules, because even if it's done correctly, if the appearance is bad, it undermines confidence and faith in the regulation and how well it's done. But I think that what we really have seen some bad situations that have not yet been very effectively dealt with financial manipulations that produce huge wealth without generating any real value. And I'm not against generating wealth. I think if it's done and there's something to show for it at the end of the day, and then we get tax revenue and the whole community benefits, and you benefit from the stuff that's being produced as well. I mean, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or people like that, they great. But someone engaging in an arbitrage and manipulating something around, and what have they produced at the end of the day? But they've somehow managed to squeeze some money out of the tax code or out of, and this is a problem for internationally with very cheap communications and computers, and they can basically siphon money out of tax systems around the world right now, between tax-free and taxable entities and different tax rates. And there's not a lot, people are waking up to that and trying to figure out how to modernize the way we do have to support government at some level. We could argue about the rates and everything else, but no one's going to say you aren't going to have to extract some money from society to pay for a government sector. And right now it's becoming increasingly hard because of the way the financial people especially are able to manipulate the system. I visit a lot of companies, though, in our area. Of course, the medium-sized, some of the really big ones are basically working for pension companies and insurance companies, and there's no one who, so they're almost social institutions in a sense, and their stockholders are our parents or grandparents or people or union pension funds and all of this. Most of the others that are of any size, certainly in our area, not an awful lot of them in the area are family-owned. People have a commitment to the community, and Wisconsin now has the highest percentage of manufacturing jobs of any state, and the district I represent is by far #1 in Wisconsin in number of 90,000 people work in jobs. The big problem we have really, and there are a lot of articles about it's a bad economy, but it's also the world of work has been changing so fast. It requires now, you're not really just putting pieces together or doing a mechanical repetitive process. You're increasingly managing equipment and machinery and supervising, even if not other people, a part of the operation. And teachers in my area who are working on this say it used to be, we couldn't say this publicly, if we could educate 20% of the students to be functionally literate and the rest to show up on time and work as a group and follow instruction, they could all get pretty good jobs. Now we've got to educate 80% to do that and to be able to work with people of different skill levels, because the guy on the factory floor can be dealing with a customer now in some repair shop or showroom or something, because with computers and instant communications, they're eliminating all kinds of levels of management, and you don't have the old sort of industrial and military system of management. People are being empowered to manage their own jobs and inspect their own work and so on and so forth. It's a rapidly changing world. So there are lots of companies that are looking for people right now. At the same time, there are a lot of people looking for jobs. And the difficulty has to do with doing a better job of we're going to have to be spending a lot more on training and this sort of thing, or helping people to acquire the skills that are needed. Maybe there's some modification that can be done on the other side, but it's very, very hard.
Okay, thank you. Do we have some other questions?
Yes, I'm wondering on all the laws that you guys passed, how well do they stack on up against the Constitution? That do you actually take that law, whatever, that, and hold it up to the Constitution and what it actually says? Does it actually enforce what's there or what's not? Because
Okay.
I know there's a lot of laws passed that looks like they do not enforce what's actually written down in the Constitution. And every elementary school, all the way up to college, I don't know about law school, but states that the Constitution is the law and that the government is limited by it. And I just want to know there, because I've seen a lot of laws that pass, which are probably more numerous than what I can, even mention here on this. But I'd like to know your guys' thought on it. Do you actually check, take the law, whatever, hold it up against the amendments or whatever, check, does it enforce what's actually there?
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me say that I don't know what the number is today, but 3 years ago, there was a study done that said that for the ideas that pass the Congress, not for all the ideas that are tossed out there, but for all of the ideas that actually pass the Congress, it takes an average of 7 years to get them through. When you have to work that hard for 7 years to get something done, I don't think you're looking to waste your time on something that you believe is unconstitutional. I simply want to read to you what the preamble to the Constitution says, because that defines what we're supposed to do in Congress. And it's pretty general and it's pretty broad. I said, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I think that's a pretty broad license to do what we think is in the common interest, or in the words of the Constitution, what does promote the general welfare. So I just, the Supreme Court, what I find interesting is some of the people who say that Congress passes all kinds of laws that are unconstitutional and we should be ashamed of ourselves. They're at the same time, you look at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has reshaped or tossed out a lot of things that the Congress has done. And some of the same people who don't like what Congress does also will attack the court and accuse the court of not following the Constitution either. So, I mean, people have very different views of what's constitutional, but we have a defined process that determines, in the end, what stands and what doesn't. And we can rail at some of those decisions. I, for instance, detest some of the decisions that the Supreme Court has come down with in campaign financing. They've essentially opened up corporate treasuries and they can spend almost anything they want to spend in an election anonymously because limitations that the Congress has placed on spending have been declared unconstitutional by the court. So, I mean, I think Congress, regardless of party, people, I don't know very many members of Congress who say, well, we know doggone well this is constitutional, but to hell with it, we're going to pass it anyway. I mean, they just don't think that way. People try to do their jobs in a responsible way, and you have honest differences about what is consistent with the Constitution and what isn't.
I'd just say that one thing, when you after you spend some time doing one of these congressional jobs, maybe any kind of a job, you start having a little more appreciation for people who used to do that job in a different time, an earlier time. And one of my hobbies for some years now has been to sort of reread or read for the first time a lot of biographies. A lot of Americans are doing that, of some of the founding fathers. Or there's one, I'm on page 680 of Ron Chernow's book, Washington, A Life. It's about the 5th book I've read on Washington, for example. It's really fascinating. He's looking at Washington as the politician, which he was a very good politician, even though, partly because he didn't appear to be particularly. And half of the response to your question, half of the things that Washington was going through in his first and second administration was sitting down and writing letters and talking to some of the people in his cabinet and people he respected. They had the Constitution. Now, what does this mean? For he had to be he's the first president. We're setting precedents. One of the things said he should enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, what does that mean? He thought it meant he should walk over to the Senate and say, "Here's a treaty, what do you think of it?" And so that's what he did the first time. And the senators, it was some Indian treaty or something, and the senators, first of all, they didn't know how to behave. Because they didn't want to be disrespectful, because he was the founder of the country, he's the first leader. On the other hand, we are a republic. He's not a king or anything. Should they stand up when he comes in or sit down? All these sort of issues. And should they just say, "Yes, you're right, Mr. President," or what? And they finally, I may get it slightly wrong, but I think they finally sort of tabled it or did something and told him they weren't going to debate it while he was there. They wanted to debate it, use their own judgment separately, and he sort of got angry and stalked out and said, "Well, that's the last time I go there." But it was they were trying to figure out in practice what some of the language meant, and we're still in different areas trying to figure out, partly because changes in technology, or I alluded to a little bit, something that may have made a lot of sense 200 years ago, like post roads, for example. Federal government's supposed to do post. We still do roads, but it's not for the delivery of the mail anymore. We're going to be doing that electronically. It's for more general commerce. We had a big fight, which is still unresolved, over the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. That was agreed for good reasons to regulate commerce between the states, because they had been independent countries. They were setting up tariffs, and we wanted to have a common market the way the Europeans have done in North America. How far to carry that is an area where people are still disagreeing. Can they regulate commerce between the states? Yes. What if it's just in a state, but it affects interstate commerce? And that was a huge debate, and it's still not completely resolved. The Depression and Franklin Roosevelt resolved it at that time because the court declared much of the early New Deal unconstitutional in violation of the Commerce Clause, because it was doing things that were not directly regulating activity between the states, and there was no other real authority for that. But they gradually expanded that, and then finally in the late 30s opened it quite wide. So they said, well, if it could affect interstate commerce, it's under the Commerce Clause, and that's where that largely stands today. So it's been an area of, there are a number of areas in the Constitution of great, what we've thought was constitutional has been changed. Slavery is a good example, where the separate but equal, first it was equal rights, and we adopted a number of constitutional amendments after the Civil War to provide for that. Then after Reconstruction, they thought, well, if people were treated equally, even if they were separated, that was okay. And then upon reflection, the Supreme Court said, no, it's not, and we ended up with school integration and a number of other programs currently, which are now people are thinking maybe don't pass constitutional muster again on whether you can have affirmative action, because is that really treating people equally if you're treating people differently because of their background, because of a history of discrimination? So they're kind of saying, well, that was okay because of the history, but now as we get further from that history and we are accomplishing the purposes of that, we maybe have to move away from some of these affirmative action programs. So,
Thank you. I think we might have time for another question.
What solutions do you have for decreasing the wealth gap? The gap between the rich and the poor. The paper, Wausau Daily Herald, said 80% of the people are not middle class now. I don't know what the cutoffs were, but there's a definite wealth gap.
Well, I mean, if you look at it historically, 1929, we had a huge gap between the top 10% and everybody else. And then a number of things happened over the next 20 years to turn that around quite a bit. Stronger labor laws gave workers an opportunity to bargain for a bigger piece of the action at the bargaining table. That's one way that you can reduce the gap. The second thing you did was to institute progressive taxation. I mean, the whole idea of the progressive income tax originated here with Bob La Follette. If you take a look here at the state budget, I asked the Fiscal Bureau how the income tax rates had changed in Wisconsin since the day that I left the legislature in '69. And what they said was the bottom rate has increased by 70%. And the top rate for people to make over 210 grand has declined by 22%. If all you did was adjust that top rate to the level that it was at when Warren Knowles was governor, there would be an extra $600 million in the Treasury. Having a more progressive tax code is another way to do it. There are two new studies just out about 5 weeks ago, which both of those studies make the point that the way that executive compensation is set by corporate boards has a huge impact over time on the gap between the rich and the poor. The real gap is not the top 10% versus everybody else. The real gap is the top 100th of 1% versus what happens to everybody else. I mean, that top 100th of 1%, everybody's living like Michael Jordan. And unless that study very firmly demonstrates, in the view of the authors, that unless you do something to change the way executive compensation is provided, that gap will continue to grow. The other thing is education. I mean, we talk about being an equal opportunity country, but if you take the the best performing 8th graders, the top 20% of kids in terms of academic performance in the 8th grade, and you then divide them up by income groups, and then say, okay, now what's their chance of graduating from college? The top 20% in terms of income, and keep in mind these are all high-performing kids academically, but the top 20% of those kids in terms of family income they've got a 73% or 76% chance of graduating from college. If you're in the bottom 20% by family income, you got about a 26%, or no, 29% chance of graduating from college. So, I mean, if you want to create more equal opportunity, we've got to do more than we're doing on that. And to me, those are starters, but it's a very complicated and very controversial issue. And if we, in my view, if we don't do it, I think that is the single biggest social problem we have. Because unless you can deal with it, and I mean, you aren't going to have everybody in this country making the same. I mean, you don't want that. You want to reward initiative. You want to reward imagination. You want to reward hard work and entrepreneurship. But there are certain norms of decency that ought to be recognized. And in my view right now, the political class isn't doing very much about that.
You know, we argue about this at town meetings and things all the time because it is a problem, and it's very much on people's minds. And one of the things is that wealth is different than income in the sense that people who have wealth may not necessarily need to have any income. And so you can't necessarily get after the top 1/10 of 1% through the income tax system because they already have the money. And a couple things. We are living right now in probably the greatest uplifting of the largest number of people in the history of the world, in India and China and other places. Hundreds of millions of people in the last 20 or 30 years have moved from abject poverty with no access to much of anything except subsistence living to what we would have regarded as a pretty good lifestyle 40 or 50 years ago in this country. We now, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in a place called Somalia, where the family income, where the individual income was $50 a year, and it changes your perspective on. I mean, you know what a subsistence income is, so on. Now we're feeling somehow oppressed if we don't have the latest iPad or something. And I don't necessarily even want, I'm still adjusting to whether I want one or not, let alone. So if you visit these ancient emperors' palaces in Europe, they lived worse than we do now in terms of they didn't have indoor plumbing sometimes. I guess they had a pot that they went into and so on, and they were emperors. So we really, it's more not the fact that people are, in our country, there are people who have problems, but it's whether we were willing to tolerate a difference in wealth as opposed to even to consumption. Because I'm not sure some of the wealthy probably, they won't have it for very long if they blow it, but many of them live fairly frugally, I think. Some who don't. I was visiting yesterday with a fellow in my district who makes burger boats. They call it the world's biggest toys for boys. They cost $30 million a pack. And he said, people don't think of it this way, but I do. I'm redistributing wealth because I get $30 million from one of these rich guys, and I hire 200 people, and they make money, and this guy gets this boat at the end of the time, and he has to spend a lot more money maintaining the darn thing and hiring more people to maintain it. So it's causing economic activity, and if you eliminate him, you'll eliminate the 200 jobs, and maybe you can find something else for people to do, but maybe won't. So it is a problem. I don't think you're going to get at it personally necessarily through the income tax code. You will somewhat disparities of income, but not necessarily disparities of wealth. You do have big salaries being earned, not just in the academic field, but college football coaches, I think sometimes are making a lot of money, and all kinds of, certainly entertainment stars, because of the change in the global communications. If you hit it big, you're making hundreds of millions of dollars a year sometimes, because everyone in the world wants to pay 50 cents to see the modern, or at $5 or $20 to see the modern equivalent of the Beatles or something perform in their area or on some movie stage or the like. And I don't think too many people really end up begrudging that at the end of the day, because they're willing to pay their money to make that possible.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that we've run a deficit, a time deficit. I'm not sure how we're going to make that up. But out of respect for you, for Congressman Petri, because I know he's going to get right back on the road, I think we need to end here. However, I believe that they have agreed to stick around for another few minutes outside where there is still hopefully a little food left and some drink. And so please stick around and say hello and talk and enjoy yourselves. And I want to, at this time, please ask you to join me in a round of applause for our wonderful guests tonight. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, because obviously most of you have paid to be here. We hope that you feel the money was well spent, and as I said, the money will be going directly to the Student Leadership Program, and we're so grateful that you decided to contribute and come and help us with that. So please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you so much. So please have a good night and drive safely, and we'll see you soon.